My dad sent me a calendar invite for Christmas Eve dinner. Formal, with a subject line and everything. The body said, "Dress nicely. Arrive by 6. Your brothers-in-laws will be joining us. No, can't wait to see you. No, can't wait to see you. No love, Dad." Just a calendar invite. Like I was a vendor being scheduled for a meeting. I accepted it. Out of habit mostly. I've been accepting things from my family out of habit for as long as I could remember. Then, 3 days later, my mom called. I was on my lunch break, sitting in my truck outside a job site, eating a sandwich I hadn't tasted. She got to the point in under 60 seconds, which is actually a record for her. "We've been thinking, and with the Hargroves coming, it's going to be a full house. Maybe this year you just do your own thing. It'll be easier on everyone." I held the phone away from my face for a second. Easier on everyone. Not easier for you. Not we're short on space. Everyone. Like my presence was a logistical burden the family had been quietly managing for years, and this was finally the year they decided to stop. I said, "Sure, Mom. No problem." And then I hung up and sat in that truck for 20 minutes staring at a porta potty across the parking lot. I'm 32 years old. I work in structural engineering. I've built bridges, literally. I designed a pedestrian overpass last spring that 40,000 people walk across every week. And I couldn't figure out how to feel about being uninvited for my own family's Christmas dinner. So I just sat there. And then I drove back to the job site and didn't think about it until I got home that night and poured myself a drink and thought about nothing else. Let me back up. My name is Cole Whitfield. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, in a beige house on a street full of beige houses, with parents who believed in the appearance of a good family more than the actual thing. My dad taught high school history and coached JV soccer. My mom ran a small event planning business and cared deeply about what the neighbors thought. They were not bad people, but they were people who had a favorite, and they'd never once tried to pretend otherwise. My brother's name is Preston. He's 4 years older than me, and growing up, Preston was the kind of kid whose name teachers said with warmth. He played varsity everything. He married his college girlfriend, Natalie, whose father apparently owns a chain of car dealerships in Indiana. They have a house in the suburbs of Chicago, with a 3-car garage and a dog named something that sounds like a wine brand. He is, by every metric my family uses to measure a person, a success. Me? I was the quiet one. The one who built things in the garage. The one who got into a state school instead of Purdue. Took 5 years to finish because I worked 30 hours a week to pay for it, and then moved to Denver after graduation to take a job nobody in my family could describe at a dinner party without getting confused. He does something with buildings. I didn't resent Preston for any of it. He didn't ask to be the golden one. What I resented was the way my parents arranged their attention like furniture in a showroom, every piece placed to impress visitors. And I was the chair they kept in the back room because it didn't match the set. Over the years, I'd learned to stop expecting much. I stopped calling my dad just to talk because the conversations always ended up being about Preston somehow. I stopped telling my mom about work because she'd nod politely and then say, "Oh, Preston and Natalie are thinking about a vacation home. Isn't that exciting?" I started showing up at Christmas with a bottle of wine and a ready smile and leaving with neither. But I kept showing up because somewhere in me, there was still a kid who thought if he was present enough, consistent enough, easy enough, they'd eventually turn around and see him. Last year, I bought a house in the mountains. Not a cabin, not a fixer-upper. A proper house. 4 bedrooms, 11 acres, a creek running along the back property line, a great room with a stone fireplace tall enough to stand inside. I found it in October, made an offer in November, and closed in January. I paid cash. I had been saving methodically for 6 years, living below my means the way nobody in my generation is supposed to admit to, and when the moment came, I moved on it without hesitation. I didn't tell my family, not because I was hiding it. I told them things before. I told them about my promotion. I told them when I was nominated for a regional engineering award. They'd smiled and nodded and pivoted back to Preston. So I just kept the house to myself, put it in a folder labeled mine, and let it sit there. When my mom called to uninvite me from Christmas, I'd already been planning something. Not out of spite, not yet, just because I had this house and I had space and I had people in my life who mattered. And it occurred to me that I'd spent the last several Christmases driving home to a family that made me feel like a guest, when I could be spending it somewhere that actually felt like belonging. I texted my friend Gideon that night. We'd met in grad school and he had a way of saying true things very simply. I told him what happened. He texted back 4 words. So what are you doing? And that was the moment I stopped asking permission. I opened my contacts and started scrolling. I thought about who had actually shown up for me in the last few years. Not who I was obligated to invite. Who I wanted in that house. There was my cousin Ren, who had called me on my birthday every single year since I was 16, who'd been quietly pushed out of family events herself, because she was going through a divorce and my mom found divorce inconvenient to explain to the Hargroves. There was my uncle on my dad's side, Warren, who everybody treated like he wasn't quite as serious as the rest because he'd spent 20 years as a high school art teacher and hadn't made a lot of money doing it. There was my old roommate Theo, who I knew was spending Christmas alone because his family was overseas, and he'd mentioned it twice in the last month, and that way people do, when they're not quite asking, but they are. And there were others. A colleague who'd relocated to Denver from Boston and had nobody here yet. A woman from my climbing gym, Petra, who'd just left a bad situation and was trying to figure out what her life looked like now. My neighbor from down the road, an older man named Lloyd who'd lost his wife 2 years ago and whose kids were scattered across 3 time zones. I texted Ren first. Hey, don't have plans for Christmas, do you? She replied in 3 seconds. Why? Because I have a house in the mountains and room for everybody Mom didn't want. There was a pause. Then Gage. Wait, you have a house? I sent her 3 photos. The fireplace, the creek, the back porch with the Rockies sitting behind it like they'd been placed there for the shot. She called me immediately. I could hear her crying a little, which she'd deny if you asked her. After we hung up, I sat down with a legal pad and wrote out every name. Then I started calling. Uncle Warren said yes before I finished the sentence. Theo said, Cole, are you serious right now? And then started asking about ski conditions. My colleague Maya said she'd been dreading the holiday, and could she bring her dog, and I said yes to both. Petra said she needed a few days to think about it, and then texted me at midnight that same night, I'm in. Thank you. Lloyd was the one I wasn't sure about. He was private, still grieving in that quiet way where you can tell a person is rebuilding themselves from the inside out and doesn't want to be fussed over. I knocked on his door instead of calling. He answered in a flannel shirt with paint on his sleeve. I told him what I was doing. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, What time should I be there? Within 48 hours, I had 23 people coming for Christmas. Then Ren started making calls of her own. She had a friend from college, Simone, who was newly single and 3 months sober and terrified of how she was going to get through the holidays without a plan. Ren asked me if it was okay. I said yes immediately. This was exactly the point. My table was not going to be curated for optics. It was going to be open to the people who needed somewhere to land. I called my contractor friend, Davis, who I'd worked with on 3 projects and who I trusted completely. I told him I needed help turning a 4-bedroom house into a place that could comfortably sleep and host close to 30 people over a 4-day stretch. He showed up the following Saturday with a truck and a folding table, and we mapped it out. Air mattresses in the loft, 2 in the study, overflow at a bed and breakfast in town I'd call that afternoon. A long communal table we'd build in the great room from raw lumber and sawhorses. Nothing fancy, just solid. I'd done it before on job sites. I knew how to make something functional into something beautiful with the right materials and the right light. That was when I got the first strange message. It was from my mom, not about Christmas. She'd heard through a cousin that I'd been making phone calls. Her text said, I hope you're not doing anything to make the holidays complicated. It's not the time. I read it twice. Then I saved it and didn't reply. 3 days later, she sent another one. Just checking in. You doing okay? The subtext was not subtle. She was probing, trying to figure out what I knew, what I was doing, whether it would reflect on her somehow. I called Ren. She told me what she pieced together. Mom had been reaching out to people individually, same as she'd done with the Christmas invitations, giving each person a slightly different version of the same story. She'd told Ren she was keeping things low-key for Preston's in-laws. She'd told Warren she thought it would be good for Cole to branch out. She'd told another cousin I needed space this year. Each excuse was small, each one just plausible enough to hold on its own. But together they were a blueprint. She had engineered the exclusion deliberately and then distributed the justifications carefully so nobody would compare notes. The same pattern the comment people online called triangulation. I didn't have a name for it then. I just recognized it as something I'd been standing inside of for 30 years without realizing the walls were a construction. I didn't call her back. I didn't need to. I had 23 people coming to the mountains. I had Davis building a table. I had Lloyd telling me he'd bring his late wife's cornbread recipe if I had cast iron, and I said I had too. The week before Christmas, I drove up to the house to get everything ready. The air up there is different in December, sharp and clean in a way that reorganizes your thinking. I walked every room, made up every bed, left a small note on each pillow. Nothing precious, just glad you're here. Sleep well. I stocked the kitchen, arranged a corner of the great room with board games and a record player and a basket of paperbacks. I set up a space near the fireplace with a deep chair and a lamp for Lloyd, who I thought might want somewhere to sit quietly when the noise got to be too much. I called my grandfather that week too, not to invite him, partly because I wasn't sure he'd make the drive, and partly because I'd promised myself this gathering wasn't going to be a statement. It was going to be a celebration. Adding family who were already inside my parents' orbit felt like it would complicate the spirit of the thing. But my grandfather, who everyone calls Pops and who is 81 years old, and sharper than most 40-year-olds I know, asked me a direct question. You hosting Christmas this year? I said I was. He said, where? I told him. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, I'll be there Saturday. Don't argue with me. And then he hung up. I didn't argue. I got back to the house late on the 21st. Snow had come in overnight and the property looked like something out of a movie I would have watched as a kid and thought was make-believe. I stood on the porch in the cold for a long time just looking at it. Then Gideon texted. First guest arriving tomorrow? Tomorrow afternoon, I said. You nervous? I thought about it honestly. Not about the party. He knew what I meant. He sent back a single word. Good. Guests started arriving on the 22nd. Theo got there first, which I expected, because Theo approaches every event in his life like a man who is trained for it. He walked in, looked at the great room, set down his bag and said, Cole, this is insane. This is an insane house. Benny put on an apron and asked where the kitchen was. Uncle Warren came up from Denver with 2 bottles of wine and a painting he'd made of a mountain landscape that he said was for the house now, not a gift, just that it belonged here. I hung it above the fireplace that night, and it looked like it had always been there. Ren arrived with Simone in the passenger seat. Simone was quiet getting out of the car, looking at the house with an expression I recognized from people who'd been told a place was nice, and then arrived to find it was actually magnificent. She helped carry in bags without being asked. Later that evening, she sat by the fire with a mug of tea and said to no one in particular, I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't expect this. I took that as a good sign. Petra got in around dinner. And when she walked to the door and I said, welcome, she stopped and looked at me with a very direct look and said, you didn't have to do this, you know? And I said, I wanted to. And she nodded like that settled something she'd been unsure about. Lloyd showed up in a truck that was older than some of my friendships. And he brought the cast iron skillet and the cornbread recipe handwritten on an index card and a 6-pack of something local. He took one look at the property and said, Gloria would have loved this. Gloria was his wife. He said it plainly and without breaking. I thought that took a particular kind of strength. The first full day was the 23rd, and it was the kind of day that doesn't really have a story, because nothing dramatic happened and everything felt right. Theo and Davis cooked breakfast for everyone. Ren and Simone took a walk along the creek and came back with color in their cheeks. Warren painted on the back porch in the cold, which he said he did every winter, and nobody had ever let him do it indoors, so outside was fine. Lloyd sat in the deep chair by the fire with a paperback and drank coffee and didn't say much and looked more peaceful than I'd seen a person look in a long time. I was in the kitchen that afternoon when my phone lit up. A cousin had posted something on Instagram, a photo of the road up to my property with a mountain visible in the background. No geotag, but recognizable to anyone who knew the area. An hour later, a text from a number I didn't immediately place. Turned out to be Preston's wife, Natalie. Hey Cole, heard you're doing something up in the mountains. Hope you have a great Christmas. The exclamation points told me everything. She didn't know what she was fishing for. But she was fishing. I replied, thanks. Have a great holiday. And I put my phone back in my pocket. 2 hours after that, my mom called. I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief. Just checking in. Haven't heard from you. Call me back when you get a chance. I didn't call back that day. Christmas Eve morning, I woke up before everyone else and sat at the table in the dark and drank coffee and thought about what I wanted the day to be. Not what I wanted it to mean in some larger narrative. What I wanted it to feel like. Warm. Easy. Nobody having to perform for anyone. I had interest in revenge. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these things sound. I didn't invite 23 people to my mountain house to humiliate my family. I invited 23 people because they needed somewhere to go and I had somewhere to put them. The fact that my family had chosen not to be among them was not my doing. But I will not pretend there wasn't something clarifying about it. Every year I had gone home and felt like a visitor in a house where I grew up. This year, I was the host. This year, the people who sat at my table had chosen to be there, and I had chosen them, and there was no hierarchy and no performance, and no one whose job it was to redirect the spotlight. We spent Christmas Eve cooking. All of us, which meant the kitchen was chaos in the best way. Theo and Davis had built a menu earlier in the week. Roast chicken with herbs, potatoes roasted in the cast iron Lloyd had brought, winter salad with apple and walnut, rolls from scratch. Simone turned out to be a remarkably good baker and produced 2 pies from ingredients I didn't know I had. Lloyd made the cornbread, and it was the best thing on the table, and he knew it and was pleased about it without being smug. Which is a balance I respect. We ate in 2 sittings because the table Davis and I had built could seat 20 and we had 23, which we solved by pulling in 3 stools from the kitchen, and it was slightly ridiculous and nobody cared. Pops arrived at 7. He'd driven up from Fort Collins with his neighbor, a quiet man named Gerald, who I learned over dinner had been a jazz musician in the 80s and had stories that kept the table going for an hour. Pops walked in and looked around the great room and then looked at me for a long moment and said, "You did good, kid." And that was enough. That was more than enough. We were 3 hours into dinner when my phone started going off in my jacket pocket across the room. I ignored it. Ben Wren caught my eye from down the table and tilted her head. I got up and checked it in the kitchen. 17 missed calls. Mom, Dad, Preston. Starting around 9 and not stopping. Not a single voicemail. I put the phone face down on the counter and went back to the table. Later, after dishes and after Warren had started a slow jazz record on the turntable and the house had softened into that particular quiet of a lot of people who are comfortable with each other, Pops found me on the back porch. He didn't say anything for a while. We stood and looked at the dark outline of the mountains and the stars were very sharp. Then he said, "Your mother called me this afternoon." I looked at him. "She wanted to know if I knew where you were." He paused. I told her I was there. I didn't say anything. He continued. "She didn't like that. She said you were making a scene." He said it with a quiet kind of precision, like he was reporting a fact he found absurd. I told her that from where I was standing, the only scene worth making was the one happening right here. He looked at me then, 81 years old and not remotely interested in softening anything. "You were never the problem in that family," he said. "You were the proof that their system wasn't working. That's not the same thing." I had to clear my throat. He patted me once on the shoulder and went back inside, and I stood on that porch for another 10 minutes alone in the cold, and something I'd been carrying for 32 years felt different. Not gone, but different. Lighter. Christmas morning, I called them back. I went into the study and closed the door and called my dad's cell. He picked up on the first ring. "What are you doing, Cole?" "Not a question." "Hosting Christmas," I said. "I have a house in Colorado. 23 people were here last night." A long pause. "When did you get a house?" 8 months ago. I bought it cash." Another pause, longer. "How?" "I sold my stake in the engineering consortium last spring. I've mentioned my work a few times, but I know it's hard to track." The last part landed. I heard it land. He didn't respond to it directly. "Your mother is very upset," he said. "I know. I haven't done anything to upset her. I planned my own Christmas. She planned hers. You took half the family with you. I invited people who didn't have somewhere to go. Nobody was stolen." I paused. "You could have called Wren and invited her. You could have called Warren, and you didn't. That was a choice." Silence. "We didn't know you had a... You didn't ask. That's different." He stopped, and in that stop I could hear something I hadn't heard from my father before. Not apology, Not yet. But the beginning of something rearranging. My mom got on the line. She'd been listening. We just want to understand what you're trying to prove. I'm not proving anything. I'm living my life. I'm sharing it with people who've shown up for me. If you want to be part of it, that's available to you. But it requires showing up. We've always shown up. I didn't argue it. There was no argument that would have mattered to her in that moment. I said, I have guests. I have to go. Call me when things calm down. I hung up. Preston texted me an hour later. Just 2 sentences. How big is this house? I had no idea you were doing that well. Not one word about me being excluded. Not one word of acknowledgement for what the last few days had been about. Just the house and the money and the recalibration of where I stood in his mental hierarchy now that he had new data. I almost didn't reply. Then I wrote back. Come see it sometime. You're welcome here. Because I meant it. Not as a performance. I meant it. That afternoon I found Ren in the kitchen making tea. She looked at me with that particular cousin look that means she already knows most of it. How'd it go? She asked. About how I expected. She nodded. For what it's worth, she said, this week has been the first Christmas in about 6 years that I didn't spend 2 days dreading and 1 day recovering from. She poured her tea. Whatever you started here, I hope you keep doing it. I thought about that for the rest of the day. What I'd started, it didn't feel like a revolution. It felt like the first time I'd arranged my life around what was actually true instead of what I was supposed to want. The guests left over the next 2 days, slowly, in the way people leave a place they've been comfortable in. A little reluctantly, not rushing it. Theo was last out. He stood in the doorway with his bag and looked back at the great room and said, Same time next year? And I said, Yeah, same time next year. Same time next year. Lloyd left me the cornbread recipe card. I found it on the kitchen counter with a note that said, Good house. Gloria would have approved. A week later, when I was back in Denver and the house was quiet again, I sat down and wrote 3 emails. One to my mom, one to my dad, one to Preston. I kept them short. I said the same core thing in all 3, but in different words because they are different people and they hear differently. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I told him I'd spent a long time trying to fit into a version of the family that didn't quite have room for me the way I actually was, and I decided to stop doing that. Then I wrote down 3 things I needed. Not demands, not ultimatums, just honest statements of what would have to be true for me to keep showing up. Ask about my work. Not Preston's, mine, once. Actually listen to the answer. Come to Colorado. See where I live. The drive is 4 hours from Naperville. I've driven to you every Christmas for 11 years. Stop using me as the reference point for what Preston is doing well. I am not a measuring stick. I am a person. I sent all 3 emails on a Tuesday afternoon. Then I went for a run in the cold and didn't check my phone for 2 hours. When I came back, there were 3 replies. My dad's was 4 sentences. He said he didn't realize how one-sided things had become, that he was proud of what I'd built in Colorado, that he didn't know how to visit yet, but he wanted to figure it out. Preston's was longer. He'd started it in defense mode. I could feel it in the first paragraph, but somewhere in the middle of writing it, something had shifted. He said he'd spent his whole life trying to be the son my parents wanted, and he wasn't sure he'd ever stop to ask whether he wanted it himself. He said watching the photos for my Christmas, which had apparently made their way to him through 3 different people, had made him feel something he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy exactly, more like recognition. Like he was watching someone do something he hadn't given himself permission to try. My mom's reply was 1 paragraph. She said she needed some time. She said she wasn't sure she understood everything. She said she hoped I knew she loved me. I read that one 3 times. I didn't know what came next. I still don't. But I knew what that week in the mountains had taught me, which is that I've been waiting for my family to make space for me, when the whole time I had the land and the materials and the skill to build my own. I'm not the quiet one anymore. I'm not the background. I'm the one who built the table that seats 23. And if you want a seat at it, you know where I am. The door is open. I've thought about that Christmas a lot since it happened. Not the drama part. Not the 17 missed calls or the conversation with my dad or my brother's 2-sentence text about the house. I think about Lloyd standing in the driveway with a cast iron skillet and a handwritten recipe card, and the way he said Gloria would have loved this without flinching. I think about Simone sitting by the fire on her first sober Christmas, saying she didn't know what to expect. I think about Pops on the back porch telling me I was never the problem, I was the proof the system wasn't working. What I understand now, and couldn't have articulated then, is that the way my family treated me for 32 years was not an accident and not a mystery. It was a structure. They had built something, and I had a role in it, and the role required me to stay small enough that the rest of the structure could keep standing. Every time I showed up and smiled and didn't push back, I was handing them the materials to keep building. That's not blame. That's just how it works. What you accept, you teach people to continue. The thing nobody tells you about being the invisible one in a family is that invisibility is not passive. It takes constant effort on both sides. They have to keep not seeing you, and you have to keep making yourself easier not to see. I had been doing my part for years, selling myself in small pieces to keep the peace, not telling them about the house, not pushing back when the conversation pivoted to Preston, arriving with wine and leaving quietly. I thought I was being gracious. I was actually just keeping their system running. What I did that Christmas was not revenge. I want to be clear about that because the word revenge implies you're still orienting your life around the person who hurt you. I wasn't. I built something that was true to who I actually was, and I invited people into it who had shown up for me when it mattered. That Wren called every birthday. That Warren never made me feel like my work was less than. That Gideon asked 4 words and got out of the way. Those weren't random. That was a decade of small choices accumulating into something real. Cause and consequence don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they work quietly, the way water works on stone. My parents built a family around optics and performance, and the fear of being seen as less than, and what they got eventually was a son who stopped performing, a nephew who planned his own table, a brother who finally asked a real question, even if it came out sideways. None of that happened because of one phone call or one Christmas. It happened because a system that runs on someone else's silence eventually runs out of quiet. What I keep coming back to is this: intelligence without honesty is just strategy. Effort without direction is just exhaustion. But when you're clear about what's actually true, about who you are and what you've built and who deserves to sit at your table, something gets easier. Not painless, but easier. You stop spending energy managing other people's comfort at the expense of your own reality. I'm not the quiet one anymore. Not because I got louder, because I stopped disappearing.